Hey everyone! In the last video, you learned how mutation and natural selection drive evolution. In this video, we'll talk about some of the commonly held misconceptions of evolution, and in doing so, try to understand it better. Remember to fill out the learning guide as you go, and at the end of the video, you should be able to answer, well, not answer, but do two things. And the two things that I would like you to be able to do by the end of the video is, number one, be able to identify misconceptions of evolution. And number two, correct those misconceptions. And the first misconception that we'll deal with is the mistaken idea that species or populations always adapt. Let's consider two populations of humans, and I'm going to give them really original names, Population 1 and Population 2. Initially, both have all HBB plus alleles, but in Population 1 only, a mutation converts an HBB plus allele to an HBBS allele. Assuming this mutation occurs in a gamete, some resistant offspring can be produced, while other offspring are still susceptible. While in population 2, this mutation, just by chance, does not occur, so future generations are still completely susceptible to the malaria parasite. Now keep in mind that whether this mutation occurs or not does not depend on the presence or absence of malaria. Mutation is random. Now let's say that malaria is then introduced to both of these populations. Because there are some resistant individuals in population 1, over time, malaria resistance will spread by natural selection, and this population will likely survive and adapt. In population 2, the whole population is susceptible. So it's quite possible that if the parasite is lethal enough, the population could decrease and even die out because a genotype that can survive this environment didn't exist in this population. And this has occurred many times throughout history, both at the level of populations and at the level of entire species that have failed to survive an environmental change. Perhaps the most famous example of this is the extinction of the dinosaurs, almost all of which died out at the end of the Cretaceous period. Most groups of dinosaurs didn't have the necessary genetic variation or adaptations to survive such a catastrophic environmental change, except for the ancestors of the modern birds. Genotypes allowing flight probably helped, and we can see this as well with all human species that have existed on Earth. These are all species of the genus Homo. And Homo sapiens, that's us, are the only ones left. In fact, it's worth noting that most species that have ever existed on Earth are now extinct. Survival and adaptation is the exception, not the rule. So we can now correct this misconception. Rather than species always adapting, most species go extinct. And if you want to read some fun science fiction that speculates what things would be like if Neanderthals survived instead of us, check out the book Hominids. It's a really fun read. And another common misconception that we can also deal with here is the mistaken idea that environmental change causes beneficial mutations that are needed for natural selection. In fact, environmental change, like the introduction of malaria, doesn't cause the mutation that created the HBBS allele. It only selects for, or causes more reproduction from, individuals with genotypes that have the HBBS allele that the mutation produced. So environmental changes don't cause mutations and don't cause new genotypes to be produced. They only select for or against the genotypes that already exist in a population. If by chance the HBBS allele was not produced by mutation in population 1, well, this population would be in a bit of trouble. Because mutations happen randomly and not in response to environmental changes, the evolution of a new trait like malaria resistance requires a bit of luck. Or if you're uncomfortable with the idea of luck, we could say instead that evolution involves quite a bit of chance. In this example, for resistance to malaria to emerge, a gene, among all the other genes, has to be randomly mutated in just the right way, that it just happens to make the offspring of that individual reproduce more in a given environment, namely in the presence of malaria. Both the allele and the environmental pressure that selects for it have to be present for natural selection to occur. So we can now make our correction to misconception 2 and say that environmental change does not cause beneficial mutations. Beneficial mutations occur randomly and in fact are quite rare. Most mutations have no effect or a negative effect on an organism's fitness. Okay, so our third misconception we'll debunk is that individuals evolve. Individuals don't evolve. That's something that populations do. Recall from the last video that evolution is genetic change over time, and that this genetic change comes with the emergence of new traits and phenotypes. Even if a mutation occurs within a cell in this penguin, it won't change its phenotype. And this is because mutations are too rare for them to occur in enough cells in an individual to actually change that individual's phenotype. Generally, mutations occur in a single cell or a few cells, and that's not really enough to change the individual's phenotype. So you won't see a person with 5 fingers all of a sudden sprout a 6th. In order to have this trait of polydactyly, or more than 5 fingers, this person must have inherited this allele and its corresponding phenotype from their parents. So now we can correct this misconception. Individuals don't evolve, populations do. Now, many people, when asked to define natural selection or evolution, say that it's survival of the fittest, which brings us to our fourth misconception, that natural selection is all about survival. Keep in mind, though, that natural selection doesn't depend very much on survival per se. It depends more on reproduction. Of course, an individual needs to be able to survive in order to reproduce, but if they survive and don't reproduce, then they're not passing on their alleles and are in fact being selected against. Even if an individual lives fast, dies young, and leaves lots of offspring, their alleles get passed on. Fitness is literally the number of offspring an individual has. So this penguin, who lived long, is less fit than this one who died young. So natural selection is, I think, more precisely described as not all about survival, but all about reproduction. Natural selection is, in fact, survival of the fittest, but fitness doesn't mean survival. It literally means how many offspring a given genotype has. So whether the frequency of a given allele goes up or down depends not how long that individual, or on average that genotype, survives, but how many offspring each genotype has. Okay, so at this point you should be able to identify and correct these commonly held misconceptions of evolution. If you can't, no worries. Through the magic of technology, you can always watch the video again. Now that you understand evolution a bit better, we're going to apply what you've learned to two topics: the evolution of complex traits like the human eye and the evolution of antibiotic resistance. See you all later.